Lara wiped the sweat from her brow as she trudged down the dusty street. Her backpack, heavy with books, seemed to weigh even more in the heat of the afternoon sun. She had just finished her last class for the day at the academy and was on her way home to her mother's small cottage, where the two of them managed to scrape by. Her thoughts wandered to her dreams of becoming a scholar, perhaps even one of the greatest minds of her generation. But the road ahead seemed impossible. Her family was poor, and while she was bright and hardworking, resources were always tight. Her mother, ever supportive, had taught her to never give up, no matter the odds. Just as she passed the village square, she noticed an elderly man sitting by the side of the road, his clothes ragged and his face weathered. His eyes were dull, lost in thought, yet there was something in them that caught her attention, a silent cry for help, a plea for kindness. She stopped. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, "would you like some food? I have some bread left." The old man looked up at her, his face cracking into a small smile. "You are kind," he rasped, his voice low and rough. "But I ask for no charity. Just a moment of your time will do." Lara hesitated. She wasn't used to interacting with beggars, but something about his eyes made her feel as if this moment could change her life forever. She sat down beside him, offering the bread. "My name is Lara," she said. "I'm a student at the academy, just down the road." "What's your name, sir?" The old man smiled faintly. "Call me Dorian," he said. "I've seen many things in my time, child. Some good, some bad. But none so beautiful as the kindness you show." They spoke for a while, and in that short exchange, Lara learned that Dorian, despite his worn appearance, was a man of wisdom, someone who had experienced both the highs and lows of life. She felt an instant connection to him, as if he understood her in ways no one else did. But what struck her most was the way he spoke of the world as though he had given up on it, yet still held some hope in his heart. Little did Lara know, Dorian was not the man he seemed to be. And in time, their story would change both of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. In the village of Valdora, nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, lived Lara, a young woman with a heart full of ambition and a mind sharper than the steel of a sword. The village was small, its houses quaint and scattered across the landscape like an old-fashioned painting. The people who lived there were hardworking and humble, doing what they could to get by. Lara had spent her entire life here, growing up in a modest cottage on the edge of the village with her mother, Evelyn, who worked as a seamstress. Though their home was small and simple, it was filled with warmth and love. Evelyn often told Lara that the most important thing in life wasn't wealth or titles but kindness, a belief she passed on to her daughter. Lara's father had passed away when she was young, leaving them with little more than memories and the occasional visit from relatives who would help with groceries or offer small tokens of support. Still, her mother never let Lara feel the weight of their financial struggles. Evelyn worked tirelessly, mending clothes for the wealthier families in the village, always ensuring Lara had enough to eat and a small allowance to spend on her studies. Lara herself was no stranger to hardship. She walked the village streets with determination in her eyes, helping her mother with chores before heading to the academy. The academy was a beacon of hope in the small village, offering education to the youth. Though it wasn't a grand institution, it was all Lara needed to nourish her dream of becoming a scholar, an academic who would someday write books that could change the world. But dreams cost money, and money was something Lara did not have in abundance. The cost of books and supplies was a constant struggle, and though her brilliance shone in the classroom, the other students' wealthy backgrounds often left her feeling out of place. She worked odd jobs, delivering goods, tutoring younger children, or even helping with gardening in exchange for a small fee. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on that particular day, Lara's thoughts were preoccupied with how she would afford the next round of books for her studies. She walked slowly toward home, feeling the weight of her responsibilities. She passed by the rows of villagers' homes, each with its own story of perseverance, each with its own hidden sorrow. But as she reached the square, something caught her eye. Sitting on the cobblestone path was a figure, hunched over, cloaked in ragged clothes. It was an elderly man, his face covered in a tangle of graying beard, his hands shaking as he held out a tin cup. Lara's first instinct was to ignore him. There were beggars in every village, and people who did not want to be bothered often walked quickly past. But there was something different about this man. His eyes, though dull and tired, seemed to hold a depth of wisdom and something more. She could not quite place it, but it tugged at her. The mysterious beggar. Lara hesitated for a moment before stopping in front of the man. She could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he were looking straight into her soul. Despite his tattered clothes and rough appearance, there was an undeniable presence about him. He was not just any beggar. She sensed there was more to him than met the eye. "Would you like some food, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and compassionate. The man raised his eyes slowly, as if he had not expected anyone to speak to him. His gaze was weary, yet there was a flicker of surprise behind his dull expression. His cracked lips parted slightly, revealing a faint smile, though it seemed more like a ghost of a smile than anything truly joyful. "You are kind, child," he rasped, his voice low and worn. "But I ask for no charity. Just a moment of your time will suffice." Lara felt something stir inside her. She had never been one to pass judgment or turn her back on those in need. Something in this man's presence spoke to her, urging her to listen, even if she couldn't understand why. "Your words have wisdom," she said, sitting down beside him on the cold cobblestones. "I've never seen you here before. Do you live in the village?" The man gave a small nod, his frail form seeming to sag under an unseen burden. "I come and go," he replied, his voice thick with the weight of his years. "Life has a way of moving me along." Lara smiled gently, unsure of how to respond to the cryptic words. She reached into her bag, offering him the last of the bread she had from her lunch. "Here. Take this," she said. The man's eyes lingered on the bread, but instead of immediately taking it, he looked at Lara with a sharpness that startled her. "You have little of your own, and yet you offer me this?" he asked, his voice growing quieter. "A heart as generous as yours is rare in this world. Most would not care for a beggar, for they are too consumed by their own struggles." Lara felt a pang in her chest at the truth of his words. How many times had she passed others in need, too preoccupied with her own life to stop and help? Yet this man, there was something about him, something that made her feel that perhaps her own struggles were insignificant in comparison. "I was raised to help others whenever I can," Lara said softly. "My mother always told me that kindness was the most valuable thing you can give. No one should suffer alone." The old man's gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed to look at her not as a beggar, but as a person who recognized something valuable within her. "I see it in you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have the potential to change the world, young one. Don't let your circumstances define you. The heart is where true wealth lies." Lara was taken aback by his words, unsure of how to respond. She looked at him more closely now. His face, though aged and worn, seemed to hold a kind of wisdom she had only seen in the books she read, the stories of great sages and philosophers. But there was something else, a sadness, a weariness that spoke of many years lived in hardship. She stood, feeling an inexplicable sense of peace in her heart. "I'll bring you more food tomorrow, sir. I don't want you to go hungry." The old man nodded, and as she turned to leave, he called out to her, his voice growing faint. "You will be tested, child. But remember, the greatest treasure lies not in what you have, but in what you give." A growing connection. The next few days passed in a blur of studies, part-time work, and household chores. Yet every evening, without fail, Lara found herself walking toward the village square to visit the old beggar. The villagers had become used to seeing her stop by his side, offering him food and engaging in long conversations. The local children even began to whisper about the wise beggar and the kind student. As the days passed, Lara found herself looking forward to these moments more than anything else. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made her feel as though all the pressures of the world could be momentarily forgotten. She confided in him about her hopes and dreams, her desire to become a scholar, to write books that would change the way people thought. Dorian, for that was the name he had given her, listened intently, offering words of advice that felt like ancient wisdom. The pursuit of knowledge is noble, child. But remember, true wisdom does not come from books alone. It comes from life, from the experiences that shape you. Each conversation seemed to bring Lara closer to him, and though she could never quite explain it, she began to feel as though she was learning more from Dorian than from any teacher at the academy. There was a quiet understanding between them, as though they had known each other for many lifetimes. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, something else began to stir within Lara, something deeper. She found herself thinking of him not just as a beggar, but as a person she admired, someone she trusted. Her feelings, which had always been simple and straightforward, began to shift into something more complicated. As Lara spent more time with Dorian, a peculiar bond grew between them. Every evening, after her long days of study and work, she would make her way to the village square, where she found the old beggar sitting in his usual spot. Dorian never moved far from the place she first met him, as though the cobblestones had become his permanent home. The connection between them deepened, and despite the apparent disparity in their situations, Lara could feel that Dorian's words had a powerful effect on her. But the question of his true identity gnawed at her. Despite his wisdom, something didn't sit right with her. There were moments when she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a sharpness, a subtle intensity that hinted at something far beyond the life of a beggar. She noticed that his clothing, though worn, was far too carefully chosen for someone who lived on the streets. His hands, rough from years of hardship, occasionally betrayed a strength that seemed out of place for someone of his condition. Lara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, but her loyalty to the friendship they shared prevented her from asking too many questions. She had come to cherish their quiet moments, their long conversations under the fading light of day. It was during these moments that she could almost forget her own struggles, her financial woes, the loneliness of being a poor student among wealthier peers, and simply enjoy the peaceful companionship of someone who truly seemed to understand her. As weeks passed, Lara began to notice a subtle change in her feelings toward him. The affection she had initially felt for Dorian began to transform into something deeper. The way he listened so attentively, the way his eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams, and the way he seemed to encourage her to believe in herself, it all made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. One evening, as they sat together beneath the pale light of the full moon, Dorian spoke of the past in a way that was unlike any of their previous conversations. There was a time, he began, his voice carrying a distant sorrow, when I had everything: wealth, power, respect. I was once a man of influence, surrounded by the finest things that money could buy. But such things do not last. They never do. Lara listened intently, sensing that he was about to share something personal, something that had shaped him into the man he was now. I was a fool, Dorian continued, his eyes clouding with memories. I believed that money and status were all that mattered, that they would bring me happiness. But in the end, I lost everything. My fortune, my family, my friends. I watched them all slip away, one by one, until I was left with nothing but the cold, empty streets. Lara felt a pang of sympathy for him, though she knew little of his past. She could hear the regret in his voice, a deep pain that seemed to echo through the years. And yet, there was something in his eyes now, something that wasn't sorrow, but strength. It was as if the man sitting before her had transcended his past, had become something greater, something wiser. I'm sorry, Dorian, Lara whispered, her hand gently resting on his. But you don't have to be alone. You have me. Dorian's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his gaze, something more than gratitude, more than friendship. His lips parted as if to speak, but then he hesitated, his expression clouding with uncertainty. He paused, as though searching for the right words. I want to tell you something, Lara. But I fear that once I do, everything will change. Lara's heart skipped a beat. She could feel her breath quicken. The weight of the unspoken words hung between them like a fragile thread. She had no idea what he was about to reveal, but the anticipation of it filled her with a strange mixture of fear and excitement. I'm listening, she said softly. For a long time, Dorian said nothing, his eyes lingering on hers as if he were weighing his next words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. The man you know as Dorian is not who I truly am. Lara blinked, confused. She had expected something profound, but this revelation, this admission, caught her off guard. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dorian took a deep breath. I am not a beggar, Lara. I am Damian Drake, the heir to the Drake fortune, one of the wealthiest families in the kingdom. I chose to leave that life behind, to live as I do now, in order to test the nature of true human connection. I wanted to know what it was like to be seen for who I am, not for my wealth. To experience the kindness of others without the veil of privilege. Lara felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. The words seemed impossible to grasp, and yet she could hear the sincerity in his voice. She stood up abruptly, stepping away from him. Her heart raced, her mind trying to process the revelation. Damian Drake, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're the heir to the Drake fortune. Damian nodded, his eyes filled with sadness and remorse. I never intended for you to find out this way. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid that you would only see me for my wealth, not for who I truly am. Lara's mind whirled with confusion and disbelief. How could this be true? The man she had come to care for, the beggar she had shared her dreams with, was none other than a billionaire pretending to be poor. Everything about their connection, the conversations, the kindness suddenly felt like a lie. No. No, she muttered, shaking her head. This can't be real. All this time. I thought you were just a beggar, someone who needed help. And now you tell me you're Damian Drake. Damian stood slowly, his expression pained. I never meant for you to feel deceived. I only wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for who I am, not what I have. I wanted to see if anyone could care for me without the allure of wealth, and you have given me something I never thought I'd find. Lara's chest tightened, a knot of betrayal and confusion forming inside her. The truth felt like a weight, pressing down on her heart. She had cared for him. She had believed in him. But now everything seemed so much more complicated. You should have told me the truth, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You should have trusted me enough to be honest. Damian stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, but Lara pulled back. The space between them seemed suddenly vast, the connection they had shared now broken, fractured by the weight of his deception. I never wanted to hurt you, Lara, he whispered, his voice strained. But I couldn't risk you loving me for the wrong reasons. Please, believe me when I say that I love you. I love you for the person you are, not for anything else. The confession and the conflict. Lara spent the following days in turmoil. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and her mind was consumed with thoughts of Damian, of the man who had come into her life pretending to be a beggar, only to reveal himself as a billionaire heir. How could she reconcile the two versions of him? The man who had shown her kindness, the man who had listened to her heart and shared his wisdom, was now the very person she had once envied for his wealth and status. As she walked through the village, her thoughts spiraled. The other students at the academy, her classmates who wore fine clothes and spoke of wealth and luxury, were nothing like Damian. Yet he had hidden himself among them, pretending to be just as ordinary as she was. But was he really pretending? Or had he been searching for something genuine in her, something deeper than material wealth? And if he truly loved her, was that enough to forgive the deception? Or had she been nothing more than a pawn in his experiment? The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She couldn't deny the depth of her feelings for him, but how could she ever trust him again? The days following Damien's revelation were the hardest of Lara's life. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, the shock of discovering that the man she had grown so close to, the man she had trusted, was not the beggar she thought he was, but a wealthy heir with more money than she could ever imagine. She spent most of the next few days in isolation, withdrawing from everyone, including her mother. Evelyn noticed the shift in her daughter's demeanor and gently asked what was wrong, but Lara could not find the words to explain. How could she? She couldn't even explain it to herself. Her feelings for Damien were still there, raw and unrelenting. When she closed her eyes, she could still see his face, still hear his words, "I love you for the person you are, not for anything else." But the pain of his deception gnawed at her. Had their connection meant nothing to him? Was it all a game, a test to see if she would love him without knowing the truth? She had told him her dreams, her struggles, her very heart, and now she was left wondering if it was all part of his elaborate plan. The quiet village where she had spent her whole life suddenly felt like a cage. Nothing seemed real anymore. She couldn't escape the truth. And yet, she also couldn't escape the undeniable pull of her heart. She loved him. That thought made her stomach churn with both excitement and dread. But could love survive a lie of this magnitude? Was it even love if it was built on deception? On the third night after Damien's confession, she found herself walking again toward the village square. The air was cool, and the soft murmur of the wind through the trees did little to soothe her mind. When she arrived, she half expected him to be gone, to have disappeared entirely from her life as quickly as he had entered. But there he was. Damien sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, his gaze focused on the ground, lost in thought. When he heard her approaching, he stood slowly, as though unsure of how to meet her eyes. His face was lined with regret, his posture stiff with the weight of the truth he had shared. "Lara," he began softly, his voice fragile. "I know you're angry. I don't blame you. I've shattered your trust, and for that, I'm sorry. But please, hear me out." Lara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to leave, to run, but something stopped her. She wanted to hear him, wanted to know if the man who had once been so kind could explain the unexplainable. With a deep breath, she spoke. "What is it you want me to hear, Damien? That I've been nothing more than part of your experiment? That you're just testing whether someone can love you without knowing you're rich?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "I trusted you, and now I feel like I don't know who you are anymore." Damien looked pained at her words, and for a moment, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a rawness that mirrored her own pain. "I know that I don't deserve your trust, Lara," he said quietly. "But I have to explain. When I first came to the village, I had already known what it was like to have everything: the finest clothes, the best food, the most luxurious possessions. But it was never enough. I was always surrounded by people who wanted something from me. They were drawn to my wealth, my name, not to who I truly was. And I grew tired of it. I longed for something real, something pure." He stepped closer to her, his eyes searching hers. "I didn't want you to love me because of my wealth, Lara. I wanted to know if someone could love me for who I am beneath it all. I thought that if I could live like this as a beggar, without the mask of my status, I could find the truth about what really matters. And what I found was you." Lara's heart raced as she processed his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet anguish that had been hidden beneath his facade. She wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive him. But it wasn't easy. The pain of betrayal still stung, and the fear that he was only showing her the man he wanted her to see rather than the true him made her hesitant to take the leap. "But how can I trust you now?" she whispered, the question trembling on her lips. "How do I know that everything you've said to me, everything we've shared, is real?" Damien closed his eyes, his face crumpling with regret. "I don't have an answer to that, Lara. All I can offer is the truth and my heart. I may have lied to you about who I am, but I've never lied about how I feel. I love you. And I would rather lose everything, all the wealth, all the status, than lose your love. If you want me to walk away, I will. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn back your trust. Lara stood still, the words swirling in her mind. Her heart screamed for her to believe him, to accept his love, to let go of the pain and embrace the possibility of a future with him. But part of her hesitated. Part of her wondered if she could ever truly trust him again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Damien, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know one thing for sure. I can't imagine my life without you. And I need time. Time to understand, time to heal. A flicker of hope appeared in his eyes, though he nodded solemnly. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. With that, Lara turned to leave, but her steps were slower, her heart lighter. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had one thing that was undeniable, her love for him. Resolution, a new beginning. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but they also marked the beginning of healing. Damien, who had once been elusive and mysterious, now showed Lara the man behind the mask. He spent less time in the village square and more time at Lara's side, helping her with her studies, encouraging her dreams, and showing her a life beyond the constraints of poverty. He didn't demand anything from her but patience and trust. Lara, in turn, began to learn more about him, the real Damien, not the billionaire, but the man who had suffered loss and hardship, who longed for connection. He showed her the world through new eyes, not as a rich man who could buy anything, but as someone who had lost everything and had come to understand that love and kindness were the true treasures. Over time, Lara came to realize that love wasn't about perfection or a lack of mistakes, it was about understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together. Damien's past was not something she could simply forget, but she could choose to move forward with him, to embrace the person he was becoming, just as he had embraced her for who she truly was. The two of them slowly began to build a future together, one not defined by wealth or status, but by shared dreams and a love that had withstood the test of time and deceit. Damien used his wealth to support Lara's education, but never to overshadow her achievements. She continued her studies, now with the support of someone who truly believed in her. And while the world would always see them differently as the poor student and the billionaire heir, Lara and Damien knew that their love was more than just a fairy tale. It was real, and it was built on a foundation of trust, understanding, and an unwavering belief in each other's hearts. Ending, a love transcending all. The sun set on the village of Valdora, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. In the distance, the academy bell tolled, signaling the end of another school day. Lara walked beside Damien, her heart content, her mind at peace. She had chosen to embrace the love that had been offered to her, a love that had been tested and had survived. They walked together, hand in hand, not as a beggar and a scholar, but as two people who had found each other amidst the noise of the world and who would stand together against anything that might come their way. Their love, born from deception, had transformed into something deeper, something real. And in each other, they had discovered a wealth that no fortune could ever compare to, the wealth of a heart that loved truly and fully, without hesitation.